Most people don't know this single Arctic decision just made Canada untouchable friends. Thank you for being here today. What if I told you that a single decision made in a quiet government office in Ottawa, not a military operation, not a treaty signed between superpowers, not a declaration of war, has permanently altered the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere? And what if I told you that this decision, buried beneath procedural language and bureaucratic framing, has effectively made Canada the one nation on Earth that the United States cannot pressure, cannot threaten, and cannot afford to lose? For over a century, the global order has operated on a comfortable assumption. Power belongs to those with the largest armies, the deepest financial reserves, the most sophisticated weapon systems. The United States built its dominance on all three. It projected force across oceans. It shaped international institutions in its own image. It structured the global economy so that American preferences became global defaults. And for most of the 20th century, that formula worked exactly as intended. But history has a pattern that powerful nations consistently fail to recognize until it is too late. The formula that built an empire is rarely the formula that sustains one. Rome did not fall because a stronger army appeared. Athens did not lose its dominance because a wiser city emerged. Late-stage empires collapse because they misread the source of their own power. They continue applying yesterday's instruments to problems that have already moved beyond those instruments' reach. The Arctic has always been the world's most misunderstood strategic space. For most of recorded history, it was treated as an obstacle, a frozen barrier between civilizations rather than a corridor connecting them. Nations drew their maps and built their trade routes around it. The assumption was simple. Ice does not move, geography does not change. The Arctic would remain irrelevant to global commerce and strategic competition indefinitely. That assumption is now the most expensive miscalculation in modern geopolitical history. The Arctic is opening, not gradually, not theoretically. It is opening now, measurably, in ways that are reshaping every calculation about global trade, military reach, and resource access. The Northwest Passage, which defeated every European explorer who attempted it for 4 centuries, now permits commercial navigation for a significant portion of the year. And, beneath the ice that is retreating, some of the most significant untapped resource deposits on Earth are becoming accessible for the first time in human history. Canada controls more Arctic coastline than any other nation. This is not a recent development. It is a geographic fact that has existed since Canada's founding. But for most of Canadian history, the coastline was treated as a burden rather than an asset. It required expensive maintenance. It attracted territorial disputes. It generated administrative costs without corresponding economic returns. The assumption in Ottawa, and more importantly in Washington, was that Canadian Arctic sovereignty was largely symbolic, expensive to assert, difficult to enforce, and ultimately irrelevant to the calculations that actually shaped North American power relations. That assumption died quietly, and the decision that killed it was not announced with fanfare. It was implemented methodically, patiently, through a series of regulatory frameworks, infrastructure investments, and international agreements that most analysts dismissed as routine administrative activity. By the time the implications became visible, the structural reality had already hardened into something that could not be reversed through diplomatic pressure or economic coercion. To understand why this Arctic decision carries the weight that it does, the history of how nations build durable leverage must be examined first. Every major shift in international power has followed the same pattern. A resource or a geographic position that was previously considered marginal becomes essential due to changes in technology, climate, or economic structure. The nation that controls that resource either recognizes the shift early and consolidates its advantage, or fails to recognize it and watches leverage accumulate in someone else's hands. Britain's naval dominance in the 19th century was not simply a product of British shipbuilding or British courage. It was a product of recognition, earlier than its competitors, that controlling maritime choke points was more valuable than controlling agricultural land. When the fundamental unit of wealth shifted from territory to trade, Britain's island geography transformed from a limitation into an extraordinary advantage. The empire that followed was built on that geographic insight, patiently translated into legal frameworks and commercial networks that made British cooperation essential for anyone seeking to participate in global commerce. The United States repeated this pattern with energy, rather than maritime geography, as the foundational resource. Whoever controls the essential energy supply controls the essential leverage. That insight shaped American foreign policy for a century. The Arctic represents the next inflection point, and Canada made the decision that locked in its advantage before anyone in Washington was paying sufficient attention. The Arctic represents the same inflection point, and Canada made the decision that locked in its advantage before anyone in Washington was paying sufficient attention. The decision itself had multiple components, none of which appeared dramatic in isolation. Canada invested in Arctic surveillance infrastructure, satellite systems, underwater sensors, coastal monitoring stations, giving Ottawa awareness of every vessel operating in waters it considers sovereign territory. This was framed as environmental monitoring. The strategic implications were treated as secondary. Simultaneously, Canada began backing its long-standing legal position on the Northwest Passage with physical infrastructure, Coast Guard vessels, tracking systems, administrative frameworks requiring advance notification for commercial passage. A theoretical dispute was transformed into an operational reality. Then came the infrastructure commitments. The port of Churchill in Manitoba, long dismissed as an eccentric northern outpost, became the center of a massive investment program focused on transforming it into a genuine deep-water Arctic facility capable of handling post-Panamax vessels. The Hudson Bay Railway received upgrades that had been deferred for decades: new terminals, new storage capacity, new logistics infrastructure. The strategic logic was clear to anyone examining it carefully. A cargo vessel traveling from northern Europe to the North American interior saves thousands of kilometers by routing through Churchill rather than through traditional Atlantic ports. That distance advantage translates directly into time, fuel costs, and competitive positioning that European and Asian shippers find increasingly difficult to ignore. Every ship that uses Churchill rather than an American port is a ship that does not require American permission, American infrastructure, or American cooperation. Every ton of Canadian wheat loaded in Hudson Bay is a ton that bypasses the American port system entirely. This is how structural power accumulates. Not through declarations, not through confrontation, through the patient construction of alternatives that others come to depend on. The resource dimension is where the long-term implications become most significant. Canada's Arctic territories hold concentrations of critical minerals: lithium, rare earth elements, cobalt, nickel, copper, essential for electric vehicle batteries, advanced military electronics, and renewable energy systems. Every technology sector American strategists identify as critical depends on reliable access to materials increasingly found in Canadian territory. This matters because of China. When relations between Washington and Beijing deteriorated, American policymakers discovered their technology sector, military supply chains, and clean energy transition were all hostage to Chinese goodwill. The vulnerability was structural, not incidental. Canada's Arctic deposits represent the most credible alternative that exists in a stable, proximate, democratically governed jurisdiction. And Canadian officials understand that American recognition of this fact is itself a form of leverage Canada has never previously possessed. The combination of Arctic navigational control, infrastructure investment, and resource dominance creates something that historians of empire recognize immediately. It creates a position that others cannot easily replicate, cannot effectively bypass, and cannot afford to ignore. Canada is not threatening to weaponize these advantages. Canada is simply establishing that they exist, that they are real, and that Canadian cooperation is now a requirement rather than a convenience. The American response has been revealing. Washington long treated Canada's Northwest Passage claims as negotiating positions rather than enforceable rights, assuming Canada lacked both the capacity and the will to make them operational. For most of the 20th century, that assumption was correct. Canada needed American market access more than the United States needed Canadian Arctic cooperation. What changed was not Canadian law. What changed was the economic calculation. When European and Asian buyers began competing for Canadian energy, agricultural output, and critical minerals, the cost of Arctic assertiveness dropped to zero. Canada can now absorb American displeasure in ways that were simply not possible before. The historical parallel that presents itself most forcefully is the Dutch Republic of the 17th century. Not the most powerful military force in Europe, not the largest territory, but in control of the key commercial choke points of northern European trade. Their leverage was derived not from force, but from indispensability. That indispensability proved more durable than any military advantage their rivals possessed. Canada is constructing indispensability. The Arctic is the mechanism. The timeline is longer than a single political cycle. The effects are structural rather than episodic. And by the time the full implications are visible to the populations on both sides of the 49th parallel, the foundations will have hardened beyond revision. The climate dimension accelerates everything. Arctic ice loss is not a future projection. It is a present measurement. The navigational season in the Northwest Passage is extending year by year. The resource deposits that were inaccessible under permanent ice are becoming reachable through conventional extraction technology. Every year that passes without American recognition of Canada's altered strategic position is a year in which Canada's advantage compounds and the cost of catching up increases. Washington understands this at the analytical level, but understanding a strategic shift analytically and accepting its implications politically are very different things. Powerful nations consistently struggle with the second step. The psychological architecture of dominance does not easily accommodate the recognition that leverage has moved. Adjustment requires admitting that the formulas that worked in the past are insufficient for the present. That admission is always late. It is often too late. The quiet neighbor to the north has spent decades being overlooked. Canadian strategic patience is not a cultural accident. It is the rational response of a nation that understood its position clearly and waited for the moment when geography and resources would make patience pay. That moment has arrived. The Arctic decision that most people never noticed has locked in advantages that will define North American power relations for the next generation. This is not speculation. The infrastructure exists. The legal frameworks are established. The international partnerships are signed and operational. The resource assessments are confirmed. The navigational season is extending on a schedule that climate physics determines, not political will. The structural reality is already in place. What remains is the slow, uncomfortable process by which the most powerful nation in the Western Hemisphere discovers that its most reliable neighbor has become something it never expected and never prepared for. An equal. Perhaps more than an equal. History does not punish intentions. It only records outcomes. And the outcome of this sequence, built quietly in the frozen north while attention was directed elsewhere, is already written in the geography, the resources, and the infrastructure of a country that most people still think of as a polite, secondary presence on the world stage. By the time that perception changes, it will no longer matter. The Arctic decision has already been made. The foundations have already been poured. The leverage is already real. Recognition is simply delayed. It always is. Thank you for joining me today. If you found this analysis valuable, please like this video and subscribe for continued coverage of the structural shifts that are reshaping global power while most people are looking somewhere else. What are your thoughts on Canada's Arctic strategy and its long-term implications for North American power relations? Share them in the comments below.